Right, this is part 2 of the blood system. This is topic 6.2. In our first part, we dealt with a lot of the anatomy and physiology, so the normal stuff. We're now talking about the physiology of the heartbeat, the heart rate, and issues that arise when things aren't as healthy. All right, the heart is essentially a muscle that can control itself. It can contract if you grow heart tissue in a petri dish. It's actually able to contract on its own without the need for motor neurons to send it to the brain. So it can do it on its own, but it does need a little bit of help. Now, in the heart, above the right atria, there's a special bundle of cells known as the sinoatrial node, and it's known as the pacemaker. It sends an electrical signal out through the walls of the heart. It is a muscle, and so that muscle then contracts. The sinoatrial node initiates that beat, and then it also sets the pace. Now, if it becomes defective, it can be shocked back into regular rhythm. So when you see movies or TV shows where they go clear, and they put that electrical shock through the heart, it's kind of hitting the refresh button on the sinoatrial node, so that it can start that heartbeat at a normal, regular rhythm. Now, the sinoatrial node is helped by the atrioventricular node, which conveniently sits kind of in that section there between the atrium and the ventricles. Okay, so the sinoatrial node sends a signal to the atria to contract. That's the first thing that happens. That signal actually reaches the atrioventricular node, and then that sends a signal all the way down the septum. Right, that's that section there that's walling off the two ventricles down through the center. And then it actually contracts the walls of the ventricles. So it's a two-part movement. There is a slight delay between those two parts, and this is what gives the heart its two-beat sound. It's lub-dub, lub-dub, okay? If you're listening on, say, a stethoscope. Now, the sinoatrial node sets the heartbeat and the rhythm, but it's extremely responsive to, say, things from the nervous system or signals from the endocrine system and hormones. Now, the cardiovascular system has a center in the brain, and it can get signals when that bloodstream passes through it. Now, depending on what it senses, it might sense that it's low in oxygen, for example. It can make adjustments to the heartbeat through nerve signals down to the heart muscle. So if it senses that there's low oxygen or low pH or low blood pressure, what it does is increase the heart rate, and this is through the sympathetic nerve, and it's part of the sympathetic nervous system. If the opposite is true, if it senses, yeah, we've got enough oxygen, the pH is starting to increase and the blood pressure is starting to increase, just take it down a notch. It can lower the heart rate, and that's through a parasympathetic nervous system response through the vagus nerve. So the sympathetic nervous system kind of keeps you up and about. The parasympathetic system lets you wind down and lowers all those functions that you might need. Now, if you're talking about hormonal stimulation, it's usually in the form of the adrenaline, or it's also known as epinephrine, and it's produced in the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. Now, adrenaline activates the fight or flight response that I'm sure you've heard about, and it kind of complements the sympathetic nervous system response when the heart rate increases. So if the adrenals are producing adrenaline or epinephrine, same thing, then the heart rate will increase. Now, epinephrine is what's in EpiPens. So if you stab someone with an EpiPen, they're getting a dose of adrenaline. And what it does also, apart from dealing with the heart, it opens the airways and all those other kinds of functions that the body needs to ideally survive during the fight or flight scenario. Now, all of this is normal so far. We've talked about normal anatomy and physiology of the heart, but problems can arise when the entire purpose of the system, which is to circulate the blood, deliver oxygen and nutrients and things like that, becomes limited. Now, one way this system can be negatively affected is through blockages in the arteries, and we call them occlusions, and this can lead to what is known as atherosclerosis. Now, atherosclerosis is about a blockage in the arteries, generally the ones that are affecting the heart muscle itself. So the arteries that service the heart muscle, if they become blocked, then the heart muscle doesn't get the oxygen that it needs and the nutrients, and therefore the entire system is compromised. Now, what happens is that fatty deposits actually accumulate on the walls of the artery, on the inside wall, on that endothelium layer, and they're called plaques, just like the same way you get plaques on your teeth. Now, that lumen space, so that space in that kind of hose system, becomes smaller and smaller as that fat continues to pile up in the fatty tissue, and the body sort of starts to try and wall it off. Now, as the lumen space becomes smaller, the blood pressure obviously rises because the blood's trying to squeeze through a smaller space, and the artery can become completely blocked, and that means that some cardiac tissue in the heart is not being delivered oxygen and nutrients and will start to die off. Now, angina is something you might have heard of before, and it's chest pain from that decreased oxygen supply to the heart. It often increases the heart rate to kind of try and compensate, and then that just doesn't fix the problem at all. Now, these small fatty deposits exist in most people, even in kids, but older people obviously start to accumulate more and more plaques, and they've had a lot more time to do it. And these blockages can occur because they've been building up unnoticed after a long period of time. And that means the blood supply can become compromised. Now, atherosclerosis is still kind of poorly understood. There's so many risk factors though. Obviously, chronically high blood glucose, and that's caused by obesity and uncontrolled diabetes, chronically high blood pressure due to stress or smoking, and high trans fat intake can lead to damage in that endothelium, so actually knocking bits off the inside wall of the artery, and it can lead to more plaques forming and then sticking. So we often make heaps of jokes about, oh, you know, that's going to clog all my arteries. We make a lot of jokes, but it's actually most of these risk factors are lifestyle choices and therefore quite preventable. The older we get, the more exposure we've had to these kinds of things. So we start to accrue damage in our arteries and the plaques in the arteries as well. All right, they're the rest of our syllabus points. Again, remember, go back to part 1 if you need the anatomy and the physiology that didn't make sense this time, because this dealt with more the physiology and also the problems that arise.